In these challenging times, we've reduced the cost of our home insurance. Get our lowest price at the AA.ie.
Cloudy this morning with patchy light rain and drizzle. It'll brighten up a bit later with some sunny spells. Highest temperatures 11 to 15 degrees. And now you're up to date on Newstalk.
Off the ball. This is Newstalk.
Now, welcome back. We're continuing with the Sunday papers. Bernard Jackman is with us, Leinster and Ireland player, formerly head coach at Grenoble and the Dragons, and Sarah O'Donovan as well is with us, camogie All-Ireland winner with Cork, represented Dublin as well. Sarah, hoping you can hear us okay now. How you doing?
I'm good. I think this is a better connection now.
Excellent. I was just asking you before the news there, we had touched on Wayne Rooney's article and we had touched on Simon Harris's interview in the Sunday Independent. He certainly was dampening down any expectation of fans in stadiums this year. So I had put it to Bernard and he was of the opinion that players will want to get back in there and get playing rather than not play at all. Would that be your expectation as well?
No, I think it's slightly different. I think it's a bit naive for players to assume that they will be immune to this. The knock-on effect for their families would be huge. You know, we're talking about the bus drivers, the physiotherapists, and Joe Brawley alludes to that in his article. Our sport is too close contact for us to consider that we can play the game and not affect other people.
Yeah, well, I suspect we'd be talking about this if public health officials gave it the thumbs up. So it's very much on that proviso. Obviously, if it's not safe, then it wouldn't happen. It's almost if there comes a point, and there probably will come a point at some stage where public health officials say it is okay to get back in there. If that means doing it without crowds or not doing it at all?
Again, I read Damon Cahalane today with Dennis Walsh, and he makes the point that you do it for your family, or you know, you do it for your peers. So what is the point in doing it? And I know that's probably very black and white, but I suppose the joy is in seeing other people celebrate your celebrations as well. I think it would be difficult for players to get as much joy out of it without people actually supporting them.
Interesting. I presume this will be done, you know, the GPA will consult all the players and ultimately the players will decide when it comes to a GAA championship, Sarah.
I agree that the players will have a distinct amount of responsibility in determining whether it goes ahead, but I would assume that the logistics of it are just too much. The physiotherapists, the doctors, the bus drivers, the structure that requires this championship to go ahead, too many people affected if something was to go wrong and a player was to be tested positive. Yeah,
it's probably a fair point as well. So look, we'll have to see. At the moment, certainly there'll be no fans involved, and as you probably rightly point out, even the logistics of trying to do it behind closed doors will be exceptionally difficult, especially with amateur players who can't be quarantined away in a hotel the way Premier League players can. Let's move on. So, Bernard, and I know you both like this piece. Brian Ashton on page 5 of the Sunday Independent with Brendan Fanning is a very interesting read. He was coach of Ireland. It was meant to be for 6 years. In the end, it was only for 1. And Brendan Fanning sat down and had a chat with him, I presume through Zoom or Skype or one way or another, and it's fascinating.
Yeah, it's a fascinating interview. I mean, Brian Ashton, he's 73 years of age. He's been coaching for 51 years, now works as a coaching consultant, is actually mentoring some coaches in soccer for the English Premier League, and you know, he presents a lot on coaching conferences for rugby coaches as well. He's a bit of an outlier. He's got a very different view of the game, actually, and he was kind of out of fashion for a while, but it's actually come full circle, and more people now are actually starting to coach the way he believed the game should be coached, which was coaching an element of chaos. I mean, Leinster under Stuart Lancaster would certainly have some philosophies that are aligned to Ashton's vision. I mean, Brendan wrote a great book a couple of years ago now about the passage of Irish rugby from amateurism to professionalism, and some of the interesting parts of that were around, I suppose, Brian Ashton's spell as Irish coach. I was actually in the squad then as a 19 or 20-year-old in 97, and he didn't last very long. He signed a 6-year contract. Now, in fairness, he got an illness, he got shingles, but I think he only did about a year. But he was coming from Bath, where he had players like Jeremy, Gus Scott, a very successful team, much more professional than probably we were. We were just in the transition from amateur to professionalism, and his his level of disdain for our skill level and our fitness at the time was pretty obvious. You know, it was a tough job for him because he wanted to play this open, free-flowing game, and we didn't have the skill set to do it. So it kind of goes through that, but really around kind of how you have to coach players now and give them ownership, give them leadership. You know, embrace their ability to understand the game themselves and teach them through the game. So for anyone who's interested in coaching, you know, he's a rugby coach, by nature, but he has evolved into being a coach educator and someone who understands how coaching should happen in order to, I suppose, empower the players.
Well, Brendan writes that Brian Ashton was revelling in chaos before it became a buzzword. He's all about empowering the players, seeing how they'll react to different situations as opposed to rigid game plans that you must stick to no matter what. And early on in his Irish tenure, 1997, there's a Limerick get-together and there was a simple passing drill in the initial stages of the Irish training session. And Brendan Fanning writes, Ireland were awful, and it wasn't like they were having a bad day either. Ashton had a pained look in his face. This coach was all about creative attack, ball in hand. Day one, and he was dead in the water. One of his fellow coaches, former All Black Mike Brewer, recalled subsequently, I remember after that first week in Limerick, he said to me, Jesus, I don't know if I've made the right decision here. So what Ashton wanted to do with the ball, it seems, was not something that the Irish players were capable of doing. Is that fair, Bernard?
Yeah, I think so. At the time, look at the game at club level, the All-Ireland League and provincial level was more around, set piece and kicking game and pressure. And he wanted to be able to run from your own 22 if you saw it was on. And we didn't have the skill set or fitness levels to do it. I actually was one of the players who missed out. There was a tour to New Zealand that summer, and I had a groin injury and I missed out on it. And it's probably saved my career because there was a lot of people who went on that tour who never recovered from the psychological damage that they suffered, losing to third division NPC teams. And also, Ashton was very hard on them. I mean, he didn't tolerate poor skill set. He didn't tolerate poor fitness levels. And unfortunately, the Irish players, the majority were coming from an environment where, they weren't getting that stimulus. They weren't getting that skills coaching. They weren't training hard enough, or certainly to the level of the English Premiership clubs at the time. But he coached England actually in the 2007 World Cup final. So he bounced back after the Irish probably setback. And during the World Cup, there was a player coup against him. But it's interesting him speaking about that. He said that he met the players, after they lost to South Africa in the group game. He met decision makers the night before, and he empowered them to present on his behalf the next day to the players. And in fairness, like having decision makers now would be very common, and they would be the ones who would deliver the message in most elite teams. But back then, it seemed to be, a sign from some of the players in the squad that he wasn't strong enough. He didn't know what he wanted to do, and it actually backfired on him. And there was a bit of a revolt. And they got to the World Cup final, but after that, the word got out of camp that the players had actually taken over. So it's a pretty interesting example of someone trying to empower players and give them ownership, but yet at the time the level of maturity in the group wasn't strong enough to realise that was actually a skill in itself. And I mean, Declan Kidney was kind of a little bit like that as well. I mean, he wasn't your tactician or really strong technical coach, but he was very good at creating an environment where the players had the tools to set the game plan. And yeah, Ashton, he's bounced back from that, as I said, to now being seen as a bit of a visionary, and a lot of coaches are going to him looking for advice on how to coach, which is amazing. And
do you buy his recollection of 2007, that it was him empowering the players as opposed to them revolting against him?
It's a bit like Clive Woodward. I mean, there's a story about Clive Woodward where at extra time in the final of the World Cup final that they won, he went to go onto the field to talk to the players in the huddle, and Martin Johnson said, stay back. We don't want to hear from you. We have this. And, he says he knew then that he'd done a great job, coaching the team and empowering the leaders. But look, Ashton definitely would have been the type of guy who would have had that meeting with the decision makers and leaders and said, look, you guys figure it out. That's his way of doing it. So I do actually believe that he did that, and he saw that as being a positive. But I could also see how a certain group of players who were used to being spoon-fed or want direction saw that as a weakness. I mean, it happens not all the time, but it happens a lot.
Yeah. Sarah, what jumped out at you about this piece? I know you liked it as well.
Really liked it. I suppose having played with a number of different teams, you get used to personalities and you see different managers and what they bring to a situation. A manager like Ashton, I would have had one previously. He would have trusted me implicitly, and I would have always played a lot of ball on the pitch with him in charge. But he made other girls incredibly uncomfortable because he didn't spoon feed them the way Bernard is talking about. And he ended up having kind of the players who were really comfortable in his company and the players who weren't used to having so much, I suppose, freedom. And what I liked about Ashton was that he was giving you that freedom. And I know in Wayne Rooney's piece earlier, we talked about Wayne Rooney saying that defensively they got the game plan, but in attack it was their own decision making. And I suppose with Brian Ashton, he's saying the same. You know, you're giving so much, but at the end of the day, you're building a player who can make decisions for themselves.
It is interesting as well, Sarah, and Bernard mentioned it, that this type of coaching is very much in vogue now, whereas I suspect 6, 7, 8 years ago, it was all about, especially in rugby, a rigid game plan and detail, and you do this at this point and that at that point. Whereas we seem, you take Lancaster at Leinster, where it is about chaos and reacting. It seems like, certainly for the time being, the Ashton approach has won out.
Which I'm kind of glad about. Yeah.
Sorry, I think it's also how this generation like to be coached. I mean, they want to be empowered. They want to be part of the decision making, and I think it does get the best out of them. Whereas maybe my generation, we wanted, real clarity of our role. I remember, Warren Gatland, who's coached obviously in Wasps with England, coached Wales for a long time, so he understands the Welsh players, understands the Irish players through his experience in Connacht and Ireland, and obviously coaching Irish players on the Lions tour. He said the Irish players historically were the ones who wanted to know what was expected of them in each situation and the thought process behind it, whereas the Welsh in general just wanted to know what to do, and then the English were wanted to be kind of more involved in understanding the why. So it does depend on what generation you have and what the background those players have probably had coming up to that. But definitely at the moment, this generation seem to really, I suppose, crave for being involved in the overall tactical and not tactical, but also how the overall environment is run.
There's an amazing anecdote in the midst of it all, by the way, where he's at Bath, I presume, and Jeremy Guscott is there, and Ashton has gathered the group together for a training session, and it says here, Jeremy Guscott set the bar fairly high. His complaint one night about the session content is almost quaint in retrospect. So Ashton says, I gathered the players as you do and was saying a couple of things, and then Jerry turned around and said, deadpan, is that all you can effing come up with? After 3 days of thinking about it. That was it in the amateur days. I could have written that on the back of a fag packet in 5 minutes. And Guscott walked off and left me with 22 other mostly international players stood there. When I drove home and I reflected, I thought, he's bloody right. We were doing stuff we'd done a couple of weeks before, and it was stuff that they could already do. It was a really salutary lesson. So that's a hell of a story, and Guscott storming off saying, is that all you can do? I don't know, have you experienced much of that, Sarah?
Well, I'm just imagining somebody like Jim Gavin in the situation that he has found himself, obviously winning 5 in a row, and the types of players who survived if they were to make such a statement like Guscott. From my own experience, yes, there has been days where difficult conversations have been had, and the managers who tend not to appreciate it, you find yourself on the sideline very quickly. And I've probably made a couple of mistakes over the years. No, I have made mistakes over the years where I've read a situation badly, and in hindsight, I should have held my powder a little longer and I'd have got more game time. But, you learn these things in hindsight, I think.
Bernard, as a coach, how do you, and you've been a player, so you've seen it from all angles, how would you react if a Jeremy Guscott type called out your plans one day in training like that?
Yeah, I think you'd embrace it, to be honest, as long as he's a good player. And he's someone who is actually, I suppose, very professional and very elite in his preparation and mindset, and Guscott was always notoriously difficult to get on, but he had a very low tolerance level for BS, and he was a performer who performed on the big days. I think that's what you want that. I mean, if you're asking players to have a growth mindset and to crave feedback, you need to have that mindset yourself. So, and how you react to that, I think, is massive. I mean, if Ashton had kind of tried to turn that against Guscott or came back the following week with the same type of training session, I mean, that would have been detrimental. But he really embraced that. And he said, yeah, it was crap. We can do better than that. So I think you're looking in a high-performing environment, you're looking for feedback all the time. And, not all feedback isn't necessarily nice to get, but I think it helps the whole organisation move forward.
Well, it's a really interesting piece. Page 5, there's loads in it on his approach to coaching and empowering players. And to sum up, Bernard, then, it sounds like Ireland got Brian Ashton in '97. It was a 6-year deal. He only lasted a year. It sounds like Ireland just weren't quite ready for him. Maybe 2, 3, 4, 5 years later, it could have been a different marriage.
100%. Like, he was the right guy in the wrong place or at the wrong time. And definitely, he's, as I said, he's having an influence over what a lot of our coaches are doing at the moment. So he's stood a test of time.
Sarah, if we turn to the Sunday Times, page 24 has 2 really good pieces, 2 very different pieces, one by David Walsh and one by Dennis Walsh. We might start with Dennis Walsh. Firstly, the headline is, "Betting with a credit card is banned in the UK, but why not here?" Essentially, Dennis paints the picture of betting in Ireland, betting in the UK, and makes the very simple point that the legislation here certainly is way behind the UK, and that's even developed further in the midst of the COVID crisis.
Yeah, and I agree with the situation that he has portrayed. I suppose from our point of view, because of the association that we have with alcohol here, not necessarily in a good way with sport, we tend to accept as norm things like Paddy Power being our sponsor or having direct access to players and different players having, I suppose, it's not that they're outrightly advertising betting, but they're not condoning it. And we sit on a very funny precipice where we're quite happy to talk about 2 teams and put a sly bet on, but we don't necessarily understand the effects of that in the long run.
Dennis writes here that 800,000 people in the UK use credit cards for betting. 22% of them are problem gamblers. And on Tuesday, what's happened is that a law banning credit card gambling has come into force in Britain. That's not the case here. And Bernard, he's basically painting the picture here. In Ireland, no such legislation exists. None is on the horizon. The 2013 Gambling Control Bill, that was originally piloted by Alan Chatter, still in the works. It's made excruciatingly slow progress so far. It's just before the general election, it had reached stage 3 of a 5-stage process before facing another 5 stages in the Seanad. And even if that legislation goes through, there's no reference to credit card betting. And the change of legislation in the UK on Tuesday, the word is that's been noted, said a government spokesperson. And before the recent election, the wisdom of such legislation, writes Dennis, was not lost on the opposition parties. In their manifestos, both Fianna Fáil and Labour promised to ban credit card betting, or as Fianna Fáil put it, debt-based gambling. But it does seem like things have moved very slowly. Even there's talk of the establishment of an independent regulator for the betting industry. But like, this is a bill in the first place that dates back to 2013 and hasn't managed to make its way through.
Yeah, it looks like we're behind the curve, to be honest. I mean, the gambling industry said we worth about 8 billion, and we're one of the few countries in the EU who don't have the independent regulators. But it does seem to be that it's on the way, which is great. And even though banning credit card deposits maybe isn't on the agenda, you'd like to believe. Maybe I'm naive, but I'd like to believe that'd be something that they'd look at pretty quickly and copy what's happening in the UK. But yeah, it's strange that we are a little bit behind the curveball, given that it's probably an industry that's thriving and is pretty prominent in Ireland. So hopefully they can fast track that independent regulator and start to put some measures in place that brings us up to speed with our UK and EU counterparts.
Because even towards the very end of Dennis Walsh's piece, the Irish Bookmakers Association, which only represents betting shops and not the online arms of bookmakers, but their spokesperson, Sharon Byrne, said that credit card betting was discussed at its last meeting in January, and it was agreed in principle by its members that the new ban in Britain should apply in Ireland too. So that's the Irish Bookmakers Association saying that, and we'll have to see what happens. I mean, it won't be, I suspect, top of the agenda for a new government in the midst of what's going on, but it does seem like we're a bit behind the curve there. Above that, David Walsh is writing about, well, what seems like an extraordinary story in US racing, Monday, 9th of March, the FBI details their investigation into doping in US horse racing really came to light, and it seems like there's a major problem there, Sarah, and David Walsh takes us through it really, and this thing is going to blow up. This is going to be a huge scandal.
From an Irish point of view, the issue relates to the horse Maximum Security, who has been identified as one of the horses doped by service. So I suppose Coolmore Stud, in terms of their involvement, I believe they own a 50% stake, because they have come into the picture very quickly because of their involvement. You know, looking at the evidence involved in the case, or the perceived evidence, because obviously these cases are only going to trial, there is a lot of evidence to suggest that all of these drugs that I wasn't aware of to this point were being used to basically pump horses with lots of things that made them faster, stronger, but not necessarily looking at the best interests of horses. And the permissive culture being allowed by the US has obviously allowed that to happen, which is something that wasn't happening in other countries, you know.
Yeah, and just to be clear, there was a stake bought in Maximum Security, one of the horses, which is named by the FBI, and that's an ongoing investigation. So there's still a lot there to be cleared up. The wider picture, Bernard, is that US horse racing permisses the use of various drugs, effectively, that aren't allowed on this side of the pond, and naturally it's more permissive, and therefore it seems like more people are breaking the rules. It seems you get the impression from David Walsh's piece here that this is completely widespread.
Yeah, absolutely, and the two people, so there's 27 people have been named by the FBI investigation, but by all accounts, and I'm not a massive expert on US racing, but two trainers, Jason Service and Jorge Navarro, are the ones that stand out, and they seem to be pretty. There's a lot of speculation internally in American racing that these two guys were cheating. I mean, they were getting horses bought from claimers, which and suddenly, as soon as they go into their hands, the horses were improving drastically quite quickly and winning a lot of races. So, and it does as well seem that, you know, a lot of people within American racing are pretty frustrated that they weren't able to handle this internally, or, you know, that no horse has ever failed a drug test. The first horse that's failed a drug test, I think, is Maximum Security, which won that race in Saudi Arabia. The rest of the horses, from what I can understand, haven't actually failed any drug tested. So the internal measures that were in place weren't picking up on this, and it was literally an FBI investigation that's rumbled the whole thing, which probably is an indictment of that body that looks after the integrity of the sport over there. But yeah, it's, you know, just some of the numbers in terms of, you know, obviously they're appealing it and they're denying it, but, you know, they've gone an uphill battle because you know, such is the evidence of FBI processes that from 80,000 US federal criminal cases in 2018, 90% of defendants pleaded guilty, 8% were dismissed, and of the 2% that went to trial, 83% were convicted. So it's the book of evidence, and you know, when the FBI go to this level, generally they have enough evidence, I suppose, to finish the job. But it's going to be fascinating. I wasn't aware, obviously, that there was this level. I knew that. I remember hearing about a drug called Boot, I think, which was a pain-killing drug that was allowed over there, wasn't allowed over here. But, you know, when you read through this article, the level of drugging that seemed to be going on is scary, really.
Yeah, and just one point of clarification, Maximum Security didn't fail a test. It was named in an FBI indictment. So just to make that very clear, it didn't fail a test, but it has been named, the horse has been named in an FBI indictment, according to David Walsh's piece here. There is a quote which kind of jumps out from Bill Finley, who's a racing journalist with the Thoroughbred Daily News in the US, and he says, I said to somebody, if they had come to me the day before this happened and said, I'm going to tell you who the two big trainers are going to be busted for doping and juicing, who do you think they are? My answer would have been Service and Navarro, and these are the two that the FBI have named. He says everybody in this room was extremely suspicious of the two guys. Now, they have both denied the allegations. That's really important to state here. They both denied the allegations, and this will have to play out in US federal court, presumably. But US racing very much under the spotlight right now. This thing seems to have blown up in a big way, and the FBI have involved themselves in a massive way. So that's on page 25 of the Sunday Times if you want to read more about that story. Back page of the Sunday Independent. Sarah, I know you really liked Sometimes Winning Isn't Everything.
Yes. Eamon Sweeney's piece, really enjoyable piece. It talks about the nearly men. And I suppose over the last couple of years, we would see Mayo footballers in Ireland as the nearly men. And there's a great quote in the middle of it, basically saying that you have to be supremely talented to get there and be so close so many times. And I think sometimes we're very quick to throw the boot in at players and teams who just miss by a fraction. So it was a nice reminder that supreme talent exists when you get that close that many times.
Yeah, Doug Sanders and Sterling Moss, they both passed away this week. I thought this was a really clever piece because a lot of people would have seen Sterling Moss and Doug Sanders have passed away. There's a lot going on. You mightn't have been able to draw the theme which links the two of them, Sarah, but Eamon Sweeney did that really well here.
Yeah, I also enjoyed the fact that both of those sportsmen were defined not just by their sport, but defined by their, I suppose, enjoyment of life. And Sterling Moss certainly, basically became this kind of niche character and ended up in a Bond film, and despite not winning a world championship, that didn't define him. So again, I loved that link in by Eamon.
Yeah. Bernard, the Doug Sanders putt in 1970 at St Andrews is just one of the most horrific misses imaginable. This was really just to win the Open in 1970 at St Andrews. He was a golfer. It was a 3-footer. Eamon Sweeney even writes in the piece, Henry Longhurst on BBC said, so now this is it. This is what people dream about, i.e. he's about to win the Open. There's no sense he was going to miss it. But when you watch back the footage, it's brutal because he's looking over this 3-footer and it's going to turn a lot. So he's taking this, it's a lot of pressure and he knows it's a bit slippery, and he hits the putt and it turns quite a bit straight away. It's a left to right putt and takes a bit of a turn right fairly quickly. And he almost instinctively reaches after it with the putter like he's going to hit it a second time when it's moving, like a hockey, like hockey or hurling. And it's the agony of the moment. It's there on YouTube. It's almost worth a watch. And it's haunted him because it's all he's known for. But as Eamon Sweeney points out, he was a phenomenal golfer who finished top 10 in every major in 1 year, went really close lots of times, and so was obviously a phenomenon. And yet it's so easy to reduce him to being a choker. Yeah,
it's so cruel. I mean, it's a putt that a player of his ability you would expect to get, and he won 20 times on the PGA Tour, and he won big playoff games against the likes of Jack Nicklaus and Arnold Palmer. But it is cruel, and that's how ruthless sport is. That the abiding memory most people will have of him is missing. One putt, which can kind of define a career. But I mean, it's just his attitude. He didn't really seem to let it get to him. I mean, he splashed out expensive cars, partied hard with Frank Sinatra's members of the Rat Pack. He always had a smile on his face. On his background as well, like he came to the game late. He was a son of a small farmer. He picked cotton as a teenager, and his introduction to the golf game came through searching on golf courses for lost balls, which his brother would sell back to the club professional. I mean, it's not your stereotypical background. And you get the sense from this article that both people who passed away this week, Sterling Moss and Doug Sanders, they didn't carry that burden of not being, world champions or not winning a major. They seemed to accept it and appreciated the success they did have, and live the life the way they wanted to live it, which is great too. You don't want to see somebody broken and carrying that regret with them day to day.
Sweeney writes, the career of Sanders showed that the classic nearly man has to be extremely talented, otherwise they wouldn't go so close so often. And later on he says that Ashton, later life, did he ever think about that putt at St Andrews? And Sanders would quip, only every 4 or 5 minutes, which is the best way to do it, is a sense of humour, you know. And what else can he say? I would presume a bit like, I don't know, Mick McCarthy often quips that he knows he's counting down till someone asks him about Saipan when he meets them. I would presume Doug Sanders, Sarah, anytime anyone met him, he was counting down his head until they asked him about that putt in St Andrews.
It's very difficult for as a sports person to accept defeats. I know we've been asked loads of questions in the last while in different quizzes along the lines of what would you change, the game that you'd like to change if you could change the result. And obviously for Doug, that would probably be the putt that he'd love to put away. But that's sport, isn't it? You know, the knock-on of winning or losing a game, it creates so many different strands in your life. And I think it's important to read a piece like Eamon Sweeney's piece today, because it shows that these two guys who obviously never hit the peak didn't suffer for it, you know, and that's why we shouldn't hold people to that.
Well, he finishes off, Eamon Sweeney, by writing, if they fell short of the very biggest prizes, they lost little caste in doing so. Like the current Mayo footballers, Jimmy White, the Dutch soccer team of the 1970s and the Waterford hurling team of the noughties, Sanders and Moss proved that nobody remembers who came second may be the most witless of all sporting adages. So that's on the back page of the Sunday Independent there. Sterling Moss and Doug Sanders both passed away this week, and both were so close several times over to the ultimate prizes, but never quite got over the line. We'll take a short break. We're back then with the final few stories with Sarah O'Donovan and Bernard Jackman.
The Sunday Papers on Off the Ball. Tech Talk. With Jess Kelly.
On the latest Tech Talk podcast, we have an exclusive interview with the country director of Huawei in Ireland. We discuss President Trump moving away from Google and the future of the brand. Plus, Peter Coppinger of Teamwork discusses the impact of COVID-19 on their business.
Tech Talk. With Jess Kelly on News Talk.
Listen and subscribe to the podcast now at newstalk.com and on the News Talk app.
COVID-19 is a major public health emergency here in Ireland and around the world. It's having a big impact on the way we live our lives, how we stay connected as communities, and how we use open spaces. If you are planning on heading out into the fresh air, here are 5 things to remember. 1. Stay local, within 2 kilometres of home. 2. Keep a distance of 2 metres from others. 3. Go out with members of your own household only. 4. Always enjoy the outdoors with consideration and respect for the people you meet along the way. And 5. Wash your hands before you leave home, and always observe coughing and sneezing etiquette. Find out more at gov.ie. Supported by the Government of Ireland.
Need next day delivery on industrial tools and safety supplies? Then you need Caulfield Industrial, one of Ireland's largest suppliers. Our nationwide distribution service offers next day delivery on over 50,000 stock items from caulfieldindustrial.com. We supply quality tools, safety gear and equipment from all the top brands like DeWalt, Snickers, Bosch, Stanley, Baco and more. So whether you're a professional tradesman or a DIY enthusiast, shop online at caulfieldindustrial.com.
Hi, I'm Caoimhe Debarra from Throcra. Normally at this time of year, you bring your Throcra boxes back to churches and schools to help others in dire need. Sadly, that can't happen for now. But for the people we support around the world, the need is greater than ever. This virus knows no borders, but neither should our compassion. If you have a Throcra box, please hold on to it until it's safe to return it. But if you can donate now, please call 1850 408 408 or visit throcra.org. Throcra, until love conquers fear.
Now more than ever, we know that support matters. That's why we at Permanent TSB are working hard to ensure our customers and colleagues in our communities stay safe in these uncertain times. We've created space in our branches so you can bank safely. But if you prefer to stay at home, you can continue to bank with us in-app or through open24.ie. Talk to our team in branch or visit permanenttsb.ie for updates. Permanent TSB plc is regulated by the Central Bank of Ireland.
At Harvey Norman, we're here to help. Our online store is open and we can deliver the products you need to your home. So if you're looking for technology to help you stay connected to work, school, family and friends, a home office desk, a spare bed, or you need to replace a washing machine or fridge, then visit us at harveynorman.ie And right now, get free delivery on all orders of furniture, beds or mattresses over €50. Harvey Norman, your appliances, technology, furniture and bedding specialists.
In these uncertain times, it's more important than ever to support Irish suppliers. That's why Lidl are so proud of our Kickstart programme. Kickstart continuously supports more and more local suppliers, meaning a wide range of exciting new Irish products are now in all our stores. To learn more and to apply, head to lidl.ie/kickstart. Lidl, more for you.
The Sunday Papers on Off the Ball.
Now you're welcome back. Bernard Jackman and Sarah O'Donovan reviewing the Sunday Papers this afternoon, and page 6 of the Sunday Independent. Sarah, I suppose one of the very, 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 very few maybe upsides to the papers at the moment is that with so little going on, we're getting to hear from different voices. One of those voices is Jenny Egan, who specialises in canoeing. She is desperate to make the Olympics, well now next year. She was very close to making London and Rio. It turns out in her category, which is non-existent when it comes to the Olympics qualification, because there are fewer categories at the Olympics, so she has to go on a different one. It's really tough for her to get there, but she's determined to do it. Maybe just tell people about this piece who haven't read it. She grew up really from inside the womb on the Liffey.
Yeah, so it's 17 seasons Jenny has been involved in canoeing, and she has obviously said that the Olympics remains the holy grail, but securing a slot is particularly challenging is what she identifies. And I suppose the real hero in this story is her mum, Angie Egan, who for the first 10 years drove her around Ireland and then Europe to get her into the mix in terms of Irish and European championships. So her story is a story of perseverance, and also the fact that she is being trained by her brother and her fiancé suggests that she is an incredibly determined woman, because I don't know if I'd last if either of those two were in charge of my training, to be honest.
So in terms of Irish flatwater canoe racing, she's been a trailblazer, writes Sean McGoldrick, who wrote this piece, a full-time athlete since graduating with her degree in 2013. So that's really tough. Full-time athlete since 2013, trying to make the Olympics. She was the first Irish senior athlete to win an International Canoe Federation World Championship sprint medal when taking bronze in Portugal in 2018. Also the first to secure medals at the World Cup and European Championships. What's made her journey so difficult, Bernard, is that unlike a lot of Olympic sports where there are tons of categories, for whatever reason when it comes to canoeing, they seem to bring the number of categories right down. So the event that she's best at is not one she can try to get to the Olympics in.
Yeah, and she's missed out on London and Rio by one place. But yeah, her best event isn't an actual Olympic race. So she's focusing on an event called the K1 500. There are only 13 spots available, but 6 of them are already being secured by the first 5 finishers at last year's World Championship, and 1 spot's already been reserved for the host nation. So, it's really difficult, and, she says that, she much prefer to be in a sport where hitting a guaranteed time gets you in. She has to basically, nail it on a race against competitors. But what I really liked about this was, it goes back to when she was, teenage years. Her mum, drove her all over Britain and continental Europe, on a ferry with a V-bar to the roof, and she was the navigator up front before Google Maps. I mean, this is basically as I said, a 17-year journey with very close family involved, and you just love to see her, achieve her goal, and probably her career deserves an Olympics. Given how successful and consistent she's been. So, and the last thing I like about her, I mean, away from the water, she's become an influential figure in the formulation of sports policy in Ireland. She's the only athlete serving on Sport Ireland's Women in Sport Steering Committee, and she's working on policy, focusing on leadership and governance, coaching and officiating, and active participation and visibility. So even though she's very focused on I suppose, her sporting goal of making the Olympics and ticking that box, she's also going to give back and is actively doing that at the moment. And we need people like her, who are world class and are able to combine education with achievement in elite sport, being involved in the future of our sport.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I always, Sarah, particularly admire the athletes, because you remember going to school with them, who did the offbeat sports. I mean, if you played Gaelic games, rugby, football, a lot of people did. You were in the same rhythms of training. You'd see each other training, you'd see each other at school the next day. Your matches were at a certain time. It was the people in the swimming pools at 5 a.m. that I could never get my head around. And, you know, her schedule from an early age, her mum would bring her training 7 a.m. before school, breakfast at the canoe club, then school in Coláiste Ciaran and Leixlip, then to and from school for lunch, collect her after school, bring her straight to training, and then after training bring her home where she'd do her homework, study and have dinner, and then do it all again the next day. I often feel in the rugby, GAA, soccer kind of spheres, we don't train as hard often as the swimmers or the canoeists and these individual sports people.
Tennis people as well, you know, the level of training that they go through, and also in terms of their mindset to do that consistently day in, day out. It's important to, as I said, recognise Angie Egan in all this, because obviously she was the front and centre in terms of Jenny's accessibility to her sport. So big hugs from Mum as soon as this is all over, I think, when she sees back the article.
Did you involve yourself in any individual sports, Sarah?
No, I was terrible at gymnastics, and I was also tried and tested in athletics, but I just wasn't fast enough. So I really admired the players, and actually when we were playing under 17 with Ireland in the UEFA Championships, Katie Taylor would have been on the team at the time, and Katie was boxing then, and she would have been 15 at that stage, and she would have been heading off for training herself, boxing in the evenings. Now, we had done a full day's session in Clonshaugh with our team, and it was fascinating to us that she was going to find another gear and go again. And also we were obviously concerned about her beautiful face and breaking her lovely nose, so there were all those things coming into play at that point. But again, individuals going off, you know, seeing that she was trying to obviously better herself in her sport while trying to play our team sport as well. Mad.
Yeah, because Bernard, on bad days you had someone, I'm sure, to drag you along, and vice versa. When you're on your own out there, you really are in just a battle with yourself at all times.
Yeah, I think it's a far harder career to go down, the career of an individual sport. And even though they try and have a team around them, I mean, at the end of the day, you're the one out there on your own battling. The conditions are battling, you know, the competition. So I've absolute massive admiration for them, and I think they're, you know, they're really special. The people who can get to that level and compete against the best in the world.
Well, we wish her well. So her specialist event, the one she's best at, is the 5,000 metre, and to get to the Olympics she's going to have to do it at the 500 metre distance. So that's a massive difference, and she's trying to compete and get there. So hopefully she does. She's 33 years of age now. She's missed out in London and Rio, and she's desperate to get to Tokyo. So that's Jenny Egan in the Sunday Independent. Sarah, you picked out the travails of Ronaldinho in the Mail on Sunday, page 72 there. I kind of, when this all blew up initially that he arrived in Paraguay, fake passport, I thought, you know, not just as one of these stories that would blow over fairly quickly, but he is potentially, Ronaldinho, in deep trouble. What's going on?
So he arrived in Paraguay, used a fake passport, even though his Brazilian ID card would have got him into the country. And no one can put a finger on or is willing to say why he did that. It seems from what is going on currently, it relates to money laundering, and there's quite a bigger web involved. He's now under house arrest. Now, the house arrest doesn't seem too bad. He's in a hotel that's €280 a night, and he has it to himself, and he has a whirlpool and a swimming pool. And what I found interesting about the piece was that despite, I suppose, the Jack the Lad's carry on, you know, that has kind of gone through his whole career, he's still very much loved, and he seems to be able to get away with murder. Not literally, hopefully, but certainly, you know, he goes to prison. He's in prison, and he becomes the centre of the prison setup, and they're actually crying when he leaves, and no one wants him to leave prison because they've had that much crack. Like, this article is nuts. There was another piece actually towards the end where obviously different players are talking about his downfall, and what I noted was that in 2008 Barcelona sold him because they were afraid that he was actually going to upset the young Messi at that point and derail his career. So people have been looking out for Ronaldinho for a long, long time.
Yeah, that's a quote from Alexander Hleb. He said Ronaldinho eventually sold in '08 because he and Deco used to come to training drunk. They were afraid he would bring down Lionel Messi, Kleb told Voca TV.
The mad article. Like in terms of where it goes from here, if they were found guilty and if they were actually pursued individually for this, they could end up in prison for 5 years.
Yeah, no, it's very serious. So he paid the 1.3 million bail. That's why he got out of jail, and he's in this hotel now, chilling out, I suppose, the hotel effectively to himself. But yeah, 5 years in jail, potentially, for Ronaldinho and his brother. And it seems like a fairly complicated operation, whatever's been going on. To what extent he's involved or not, clearly, we don't know yet. He was, Bernard, for a couple of years, pretty close to the best player in the world. He was doing phenomenal things and probably just threw away his talent because of his off-the-field love of partying and turning up to training drunk and all this kind of stuff. But there was a time where Ronaldinho was about as good as it got.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a very good book Damien Hughes wrote, The Barcelona Way, and it kind of covers culturally how toxic the dressing room was before Messi came in, and kind of deals with how they needed to get him out. But yeah, he seemed to be one of these guys who was, gifted in terms of talent, but and made a lot of money, and from the outside looking in, you say he was very successful, but you also wonder, what he left behind. If he had been a little bit more diligent, he could have reached even greater heights.
Over on page 68 in the Mail, then, Billy Walsh is obviously spearheading US amateur boxing. He was planning on the Olympic Games this year. That's now delayed. He's been speaking with Mark Gallagher, and this is on page 68 of the Mail. He's doing fine. He is on his own. He can't come home at the moment because he's applying for his green card. And he said if you leave the country, your application becomes void and you have to start the process all over. So he says, I'm like a cage line here on my own. He's 56 years of age now. He's been over there 5 years at this stage, Billy. I mean, it still feels in the head relatively recently, but it's been 5 years. And it's kind of interesting to get his take on some of the challenges with the American boxing team. One of them seems to be just convincing the boxers to stay amateur, because he said the American team, they lost all their best boxers from one year to the next because of the draw of being a professional. You have fighters who would become national champion at 18 and then they would just sign pro papers the following week. It can be tough to convince them. A lot of our guys come from poor backgrounds, and if there's a big promoter waving loads of dollars, it's very hard to turn that down. And he's almost been using the COVID situation to explain to any of those potential fighters that even if they go pro now, between now and next July, they might have a fight, maybe two tops. So I've told them, wait, get an Olympic medal around your neck and add a couple of zeros to your contract if you do turn pro. So that's where Billy Walsh is. He's in Colorado, seems to be doing okay. None of the US team are over 22 years of age. And what really jumps out in this piece, Sarah, is just the extent to which the US boxing scene had fallen apart from an amateur level. It says here he was astounded how far things had fallen. Not only had no male American boxer claimed a medal at London 2012, but the team itself had only won a handful of fights. Preparation was so shambolic that it emerged fighters had gone into bouts not knowing whether their opponents were orthodox or southpaw. So Billy has gone in there and I would suspect turned things right around. He's replicated a lot of what he did with the Irish team, and they have so much talent over there, you suspect that sometime next year, whenever the Olympics do happen, Billy Walsh will be talked about quite a bit.
So you were talking about him being here 5 years at this stage.
Being gone 5 years, yeah.
Yeah, but in the article it says that, he'd only been there less than a year when he went to Rio and he managed to bring back a gold, a silver and a bronze. So certainly the trajectory can only go upwards. It's interesting to see that the COVID-19 situation is actually having a positive impact in terms of the pro situation kind of being, I suppose, pushed, and the money not being a guiding factor for boxers now.
Yeah.
And that he's actually able to say to them, listen, this is the Olympics. This is bigger than money. This is bigger than the, I suppose, the draws that come with professional sport. So it's great that somebody of Billy's experience, obviously the 2016 Coach of the Year, is being given this opportunity to work with boxers and not have that professional sport aspect being a distracting thing for them.
Yeah, he's one of Wexford's finest, Bernard. It's still kind of galling that he went, unfortunately, but he seems to be doing a really good job there, and he'll have so much talent at his disposal that it seems like all they needed was somebody to harness it, and no better man than Billy Walsh, you suspect.
Yeah, he was always somebody that I certainly enjoyed listening to. I would have spoken to some of the boxers who had been under his tutelage when he was in Ireland, and the respect and the kudos they give him for what he did in terms of creating a high performance environment. And we saw how there was definitely a drop down when he left. But I was really looking forward to seeing what he could do with a full cycle going into Olympics. And he still seems to have a very young group of boxers, but he just seems to be able to influence people, in a positive way in terms of their sport, which is boxing, but also in terms of being able to, I suppose, give them better clarity or better focus on what's important in their life. And he's a great guy, and it'd be great to see him back in Irish sport, because I think his skill set transcends boxing. I mean, he's someone who can create a structure and an environment and a team around him to influence performance. So. Yeah, he's a good Wexford man, and it's always fascinating to read a little bit about him and see how he's doing.
Yeah, I was quite amazed the extent to which the US had neglected their boxing. Like, it's such a rich tradition of boxing over there. Obviously, the pro ranks maybe is where everybody's focused on, but even Mark Gallagher's writing that one of the first things Walsh did was he drew the 5 Olympic rings prominently in the gym like they had done in Ireland, but he set up a coaches education programme, i.e. if you want to have good boxers, you need to have really good coaches around the country. And apparently there hadn't been a coaches education programme in the States in over 20 years. Walsh says vital that we got one up and running, because it's the first programme run in the States since 1994. We needed the fighters to get better quality coaching. So he's done a root and branch reform there, it would seem. That's Billy Walsh in the Mail on Sunday with Mark Gallagher. Before we go, you had Paul Kimmage, Bernard, in the Sunday Independent.
Yeah, just, he's 30 years since he wrote that book, Rough Ride, and, obviously he's someone I always look forward to reading every week, and this is obviously a very short article for him. He's not interviewing anybody, he's just looking back. But, Gary O'Toole asked him to, can you, at some stage during a crisis, rank your top 10 interviews, the whys and the wherefores, and can you then confess to the people you disliked before you interviewed and liked after, and liked before the interview but didn't feel the same after? He didn't actually go and do that. He could be libelous, but when you look at the people that he's interviewed, Rory O'Porrick, Floyd Landless, John McEnroe, Jimmy Connors, Pete Sampras, Sevi Ballesteros, Nick Faldo, the list goes on, and he's just saying, he's been able to do Zoom interviews and it's keeping the show on the road, but he never liked phones and, face-to-face. If he hadn't done the face-to-face with Rory, he wouldn't have caught him, go down to shop for toilet paper and, the tattered carpet in Floyd's living room. Just small things that when you read a Paul Kimmage article, it helps you feel, I always feel that I'm nearly in the room, and the colour he can put to it. So, but just a track record over 30 years of the calibre of successful sports people that he's interviewed. I think it would be a fascinating article if he follows Gary O'Toole's advice.
Yeah. Who you disliked after you interviewed them that you liked beforehand section. So we're pretty much done. Is there anything else you want to point people towards? The papers are doing incredibly well to get all this out under the circumstances, to say the least.
The volume of articles in the newspaper today that I really enjoyed is tantamount to the amount of work that's being done, and you have to appreciate all of the work that's being done by these really stellar journalists. I suppose from my point of view, the nostalgia pieces, I'm finding them harder to sink in. I think that I remember stuff differently, and things are being tightly tainted now as I watch them back or see them back 5-10 years later, or even 20 years later. So I think I'll have to go reading some fictional books, just to get a break from the nostalgia for a small bit. I don't know if either of you are finding that as well. I just remember things differently. Then, as an example, the Munster hurling final last week between Waterford and Cork was played on RT. I remember it so differently.
It's not as high quality in 2020. Is that what you're saying?
A bit, yeah. And different players and the impact that they had, and the things that they missed or the mistakes that they made. And that's not to say that these are mistakes that we should be picking up on, but I remember them differently and being and it is taking the glean off of it, certainly for me.
Okay, well, some fiction for you. We're pretty much out of time. I got to run because we've got to make news headlines. Obviously, very important to do so, particularly at the moment. But my sincere thanks to Sarah Donovan. Thanks a million, Sarah, for making time for us, and Bernard Jackman as well. Bernard, much appreciated. That's the paper review for this afternoon. Short break.
The Sunday papers on Off the Ball.
What the